I need to state for the record that I filed my objection before the retreat order was finalized. I filed it at 0347 Fleet Standard, 17 minutes after the transmission was received, and 9 minutes before Admiral Yentara of the Veshan First Fleet issued the first withdrawal command. My objection was logged, timestamped, and formally rejected in under 2 minutes by the fleet's legal compliance AI, which classified it as interpretive dissent during active threat protocol, and archived it without review. I am stating this now because in the months since the retreat, the Confederated Fleet Command has rewritten the sequence of events to suggest that the withdrawal was unanimous, that all personnel concurred with the threat assessment, and that no alternative interpretation was offered at any point. That is not true. I offered one. Nobody listened. And now 12 billion humans are on the other side of a quarantine perimeter that I believe was erected based on the wrong reading of a sound that wasn't what anyone thought it was. My name is Analyst Second Rank Teshin Gael. I am a xenolinguistic communications specialist assigned to the Joint Approach Fleet, the combined military scientific task force that the Confederated Worlds assembled to make formal first contact with Earth. I have spent my entire career studying human communication, their languages, their signal structures, their cultural encoding patterns, their emotional acoustics. I am one of 11 analysts in the Confederated Worlds certified to interpret human vocalizations, and I am the only one who was on a ship within receiving range when the transmission came through. That matters. It matters enormously, because every admiral who ordered the retreat based their decision on a threat assessment generated by military-grade AI systems that could parse the acoustic data, but could not understand what they were hearing. And I could. And I was ignored. Let me go back to the beginning, because the context determines everything. The Joint Approach Fleet was the most carefully planned first contact mission in Confederated history. 14 species, 312 vessels, 6 years of preparation. The fleet was assembled after our long-range observatories confirmed that humanity had reached what we classify as a Tier 2 communication threshold, meaning their electromagnetic emissions had become structured enough to indicate organized planetary civilization with early-stage space capability. Under Confederated law, Tier 2 civilizations are eligible for formal contact. The decision to approach Earth was approved by the full Council after 2 years of debate and passed with a 71% majority. The fleet was not an invasion force. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because the human media fragments we've intercepted since the quarantine describe us as invaders, and that characterization is being used by certain factions within the Confederated Worlds to justify maintaining the blockade. The fleet carried no weapons rated above defensive classification. Its mission profile was diplomatic. It included cultural exchange packages, scientific cooperation proposals, medical technology transfers, and a formal invitation to apply for Confederated membership. We were bringing gifts. We were bringing an open hand. But we were also bringing protocol. And protocol, as I have learned in the most painful way possible, can be more dangerous than any weapon. The approach. Protocol for Tier 2. Civilizations is a 14-stage process designed to minimize shock, prevent misunderstanding, and give the contacted species time to process each escalation of awareness. Stage 1 is passive observation from outside the system. Stage 2 is limited electromagnetic contact using mathematical primers. Stage 3 is linguistic calibration, and so on, up through Stage 14, which is physical delegation landing and face-to-face diplomatic exchange. The entire process is designed to take between 2 and 5 years. It is cautious. It is methodical. It was built by the best xenosociologists in the Confederated Worlds, and it assumes, at every stage, that the contacted species will respond with caution, confusion, fear, curiosity, or some combination thereof. It does not have a protocol for laughter. We had completed stages 1 through 7 without incident. 7 months of gradual contact. Mathematical primers followed by linguistic exchange, followed by cultural data packets, followed by visual communication. The humans responded at every stage with exactly the kind of cautious engagement the protocol predicted. Governments formed response committees. Scientists analyzed our transmissions. Linguists worked on translation. Military forces mobilized but did not attack. Civilians demonstrated a mix of excitement, fear, and denial that fell within standard Tier 2 behavioral models. Everything was proceeding as expected. The approach protocol was working. But Stage 8 was the first exchange of what the protocol calls intentional cultural content, meaning transmissions designed not to establish communication but to share identity. We sent them recordings of music from all 14 species in the fleet, art, poetry, translated into the 7 most widely spoken human languages, scientific achievements we were proud of, philosophical frameworks, mathematical proofs that we considered beautiful. It was, by design, the most emotionally vulnerable stage of the protocol, the point where we stopped being a signal in the sky and started being people. The humans were supposed to respond with equivalent cultural content. That was the protocol expectation. Send them music, receive music. Send them poetry, receive poetry. A reciprocal emotional exchange that would lay the groundwork for the deeper trust required in stages 9 through 14. They did respond. The response took 11 days to compile, which was within normal parameters. When it arrived, it was a dense data package containing thousands of files. Music, literature, visual art, film, scientific publications, architectural records, culinary traditions, athletic competitions, children's stories, historical documents. A comprehensive, chaotic, overwhelming portrait of a civilization pouring itself into a single transmission with the enthusiasm of a species that had just learned it wasn't alone in the universe and wanted to show everything it had. The fleet's Cultural Analysis Division spent 4 days processing the package. I was part of the team. And I want to tell you something about what we found, because it matters for what came later. Human cultural output is, by any objective confederated standard, extraordinary. Not because it is more sophisticated than other species' work. The Vishan have composed symphonies that manipulate gravitational harmonics. The Tarani create art through shared neural sculpture. The Kethrani build mathematical structures of such elegance that they are considered living things. Human art is not better than any of these, but it is different in a way that none of us were prepared for. It is saturated with contradiction. Joy and grief exist in the same piece of music. Hope and despair occupy the same poem. Their greatest works of literature are about failure, loss, and suffering. And they are simultaneously the most life-affirming things I have ever encountered. Their humor is built on pain. Their love songs are about loss. Their war poetry is about peace. Everything they create contains its own opposite, and somehow, impossibly, the contradictions strengthen rather than cancel each other. I spent 4 days inside that data package and came out changed. Not in the dramatic way, in the quiet way, in the way that happens when you encounter a form of intelligence so fundamentally different from your own that your framework for understanding the universe has to expand to accommodate it. I wrote in my analysis, human emotional expression operates on a principle of constructive paradox. Contradictory states are not resolved but held simultaneously, creating a form of meaning that has no equivalent in any confederated linguistic or cultural database. Standard interpretive models should be applied with extreme caution. That analysis was read by 17 people. It was noted. It was filed. It did not change the protocol. And 3 weeks later, the transmission came. Stage 9 of the approach protocol is the first request for synchronous communication, real-time exchange. After months of sending and receiving packages, the protocol calls for the contacted species to be invited into a live dialogue. This is the stage where the relationship moves from correspondence to conversation. It is considered the most sensitive transition in the entire process because real-time communication removes the buffer of deliberation. Things can be said that cannot be unsaid. Reactions can be misread, while emotional displays can be misinterpreted across species lines. The protocol contains 43 pages of guidelines for managing Stage 9, and all 43 pages assume that the contacted species will approach the live dialogue with appropriate solemnity. We sent the Stage 9 invitation. The humans accepted within 6 hours, which was faster than projected but within acceptable parameters. A real-time communication link was established between the fleet's flagship and a facility on Earth's surface that our analysts identified as a government communications center. Visual and audio, two-way. The most significant conversation in human history was about to begin. Admiral Yentara of the Veshan First Fleet was designated as the Confederated spokesperson. She is, or was, the most senior officer in the fleet and a career diplomat before her military appointment. She had rehearsed her opening statement for weeks. It was dignified, warm, historically conscious, and carefully calibrated to the human cultural profile our analysts had developed. She stood before the communication array in full diplomatic regalia and delivered the greeting of the Confederated Worlds to the human species. The human response was handled by a panel of 7 individuals who our intelligence team identified as senior government officials, scientists, and a military liaison. They were seated at a long table. They were dressed formally. They responded to Admiral Yantara's greeting with a prepared statement of their own, read by a woman our records identify as the Secretary General of the United Nations. It was appropriate, measured. Oh, gracious. For 47 minutes, the dialogue proceeded exactly as the protocol predicted. Formal exchanges, questions about biology, culture, governance, cautious but genuine interest on both sides. Admiral Yantara was performing flawlessly. The human panel was engaged, respectful, and increasingly relaxed. The tension that had built over 7 months of asymmetric communication was dissolving into the kind of careful optimism that the protocol was designed to produce. Everything was working. And then it happened. At minute 48, one of the human panel members, a man identified as a scientific advisor, said something to the woman seated next to him. Something quiet. Something that was not directed at the communication array and was not intended for us. Well, our audio systems picked it up because they were calibrated to capture everything in the room, but it was clearly a private remark made at low volume to one person. I don't know what he said. Our microphones captured the acoustic signature, but the linguistic content was below reliable interpretation threshold. A whispered comment. Nothing more. The woman next to him laughed. Not a formal laugh, not a polite diplomatic laugh. A real laugh. Sudden, involuntary, the kind of laugh that escapes before social control can catch it. It was brief, maybe 2 seconds, and she covered her mouth immediately, embarrassed, glancing at the camera. But it was too late. The laugh had been transmitted, and within the room, it spread. The way laughter does among humans. Through a mechanism that our xenobiologists call empathic acoustic contagion, and that humans simply call being funny. The scientific advisor started laughing at the woman's embarrassment. The person on her other side smiled, then chuckled. The military liaison, a man who had maintained rigid composure for 47 minutes, pressed his lips together and then broke, his shoulders shaking. Within 15 seconds, the entire panel of 7 was laughing. Not at us, not about the contact, not as a display of hostility or disrespect. They were laughing at whatever private joke had been whispered between 2 colleagues during a break in the formalities. The kind of laughter that happens in every meeting room, in every species. When someone says the wrong thing at the wrong time, and the tension of the situation converts into involuntary emotional release. But the protocol didn't know that. And the fleet's AI systems didn't know that. And Admiral Yantara didn't know that. What the fleet systems registered was this. A synchronized vocal display from all 7 human representatives, occurring without warning during formal diplomatic exchange, characterized by repetitive vocalization, involuntary physical convulsions, and an acoustic profile that the AI's threat assessment module classified as aggressive territorial display confidence subtype. The AI had encountered laughter before, in our cultural data package analysis, but it had cataloged it under 17 different functional categories. And the category it selected for this instance, based on timing. The volume, and the fact that it occurred during a formal diplomatic proceeding with no apparent stimulus, was dominant signaling. The AI interpreted 7 humans laughing at a private joke as 7 humans performing a coordinated display of superiority directed at the Confederated World's senior diplomat. The AI flagged the transmission as a Stage 9 protocol violation, Category 4, hostile symbolic display during formal exchange. Category 4 triggers an automatic escalation to the fleet's security assessment framework. Within 90 seconds of the laughter, every admiral in the fleet received a priority alert classifying the human response as a potential indicator of hostile intent. I saw the alert on my console. I read the classification, and I knew immediately and with total certainty that it was wrong. I knew because I had spent 4 days inside their cultural data package. I knew because I had studied human laughter for 3 years as part of my certification program. I knew because laughter is the single most misunderstood human vocalization in the Confederated Analytical Database, because it serves more simultaneous social functions than any equivalent sound in any other known species. Humans laugh when they are happy. They laugh when they are nervous. They laugh when they are okay and when they are afraid. They laugh when they are grieving. They laugh at funerals. They laugh during disasters. They laugh when they are being threatened and when they want to appear unthreatened. They laugh to bond, to deflect, to heal, to mock, to surrender, to resist. And sometimes for no reason at all, except that the machinery of consciousness has momentarily exceeded its own tolerance for seriousness and needs to release pressure. Laughter is the most human sound in existence, and it is almost impossible to interpret correctly from outside. I filed my objection at 0347. I stated that the laughter was involuntary social contagion triggered by a private stimulus unrelated to the diplomatic exchange. I cited the acoustic profile, which showed the characteristics of spontaneous rather than performative vocalization. I cited the body language, which showed embarrassment and social correction rather than aggressive display. I cited my 3 years of specialized study. I cited the 43 pages of Stage 9 protocol guidelines, at which specifically warn against interpreting unfamiliar emotional displays through the lens of the observer's cultural framework. The legal compliance AI rejected my objection in 114 seconds. The rejection stated that the AI's threat assessment had been generated using the fleet's standard analytical model, that the model's classification was consistent with its training data, and that individual analyst dissent during active threat protocol was logged but not actionable without command-level override. I tried to reach Admiral Yentra directly. Her communications staff told me the Admiral was in emergency consultation with the Fleet's Security Council and was not available. I tried the Cultural Analysis Division Chief. She was already in the same meeting. But I tried every senior officer whose contact information I had access to. Every one of them was either in the meeting or had been redirected to battle stations by the Category 4 alert. At 0356, Admiral Yentra issued the retreat order for the Vatian First Fleet. At 0358, Admiral Korath of the Torani contingent issued a concurrent retreat order. By 0404, every fleet admiral in the joint approach had ordered withdrawal. 312 ships, 14 species, 6 years of preparation, the most ambitious diplomatic mission in Confederated history. All of it pulling away from Earth because 7 people had laughed at a joke, and I was standing at my console, watching the stars shift as my ship accelerated away from the small blue planet. And I was the only person in the fleet who understood that we were running from the sound of joy. The retreat took 4 hours, 312 ships moving from Earth orbit to the edge of the solar system in a coordinated withdrawal that the fleet's tactical AI later described as the most efficient large-scale disengagement in Confederated military history. It was efficient because nobody argued, not one captain, not one squadron leader, not one vessel in 14 species worth of ships questioned the retreat order. They all just left. And the reason they all just left is the part that has haunted me for the last 8 months, because it reveals something about the Confederated worlds that I don't think anyone wants to examine. They were afraid. Not of the laughter specifically. Of what they had already been afraid of before the laughter ever happened. I need to explain this, because without it, the retreat makes no sense. 312 warships don't run from the sound of 7 people laughing unless the laughter is landing on ground that was already prepared for fear. And that ground had been prepared for years. Long before the fleet launched, long before the approach began, in the classified intelligence assessments that shaped the mission's security parameters. I gained access to those assessments 6 weeks after the retreat through channels I am not going to describe because the people who helped me would face prosecution. What I found was a parallel track of analysis that had been running alongside the public diplomatic mission for its entire duration. While the Cultural Analysis Division was studying human art and building linguistic bridges, the fleet's Military Intelligence Division was conducting its own assessment of human civilization, and their conclusions were radically different from ours. The military assessment focused on human conflict behavior, specifically on the statistical anomaly that had troubled Confederated analysts since we first started studying Earth's electromagnetic emissions. Humans fight constantly, not occasionally, not cyclically, the way the Vatian do, or ritually, the way the Dreth do. Constantly. Their historical record, reconstructed from their own transmissions, shows continuous organized violence spanning their entire recorded history. Every generation, every region, every political system, war after war after war, while with no period longer than a few decades in which at least one major armed conflict was not underway somewhere on the planet. This is, statistically, unprecedented. No other species in the Confederated World's database maintains continuous internal armed conflict past the Tier 1 developmental stage. Most species consolidate politically before they develop radio technology. The fact that humans had reached Tier 2, a high level of electromagnetic and early-stage space capability, while still maintaining active wars among themselves, was an outlier so extreme that the Military Intelligence Division had flagged it as a potential indicator of what they termed hyper-militaristic cognitive architecture. Bias. Their assessment concluded that humanity might be a species for which organized violence was not a developmental phase, but a permanent cognitive feature. A species that fought not because of scarcity or political failure, but because fighting was what they were. This assessment was classified. It was not shared with the Cultural Analysis Division. It was not shared with the diplomatic staff. It was shared with the admirals. Every fleet admiral in the joint approach had read a document that described humanity as a potentially hyper-aggressive species whose cooperative behavior during stages 1 through 7 might be a calculated performance concealing a fundamentally violent nature. And then every admiral had been given a secondary set of contingency protocols that existed underneath the public approach protocol, like a loaded weapon under a diplomat's table. Protocols for what to do if the humans revealed hostile intent during the contact process. The trigger for those protocols was classified as any unpredicted synchronized behavioral display inconsistent with cooperative engagement during formal exchange. 7 people laughing at a private joke. That's what happened. The laughter didn't just trigger the AI's threat assessment. It triggered a contingency framework that had been built on the assumption that humanity was performing cooperation while concealing aggression, and that the mask would eventually slip. The admirals didn't retreat because they independently assessed the laughter as a threat. They retreated because they had been primed for months by a classified intelligence assessment that told them the humans were dangerous, and that the first sign of unpredicted synchronized behavior should be treated as the moment the mask came off. The laughter was the mask coming off, not humanity's mask, the fleet's. The entire diplomatic mission had been layered on top of a military operation that was prepared to flee or fight at the first deviation from predicted behavior. 6 years of preparation, 7 months of careful contact, thousands of hours of cultural exchange, and underneath all of it, a finger on the trigger and a set of admirals who had been told the species they were greeting might be the most dangerous civilization in the galaxy. I presented this analysis to the fleet's review board 3 weeks after the retreat. The board had been convened to evaluate the withdrawal decision and determine next steps. I was granted 15 minutes to present my alternative interpretation. I used every second. I showed them the acoustic analysis of the laughter. I demonstrated that the vocal patterns were consistent with spontaneous social contagion, not coordinated display. I showed them the body language data, the embarrassment, the covered mouth, the social correction. I showed them comparative analyses of laughter across 6 human cultural contexts, demonstrating that it served bonding, tension release, and affiliative functions far more frequently than dominance functions. I showed them my 3 years of published research on human emotional acoustics. And I told them, as clearly and directly as I could, that the fleet's AI had classified a moment of genuine, unspontaneous, involuntary human joy as a hostile territorial display because its training data did not contain a framework for interpreting happiness that contradicts formality. The board listened. They asked questions. They were, I believe, genuinely engaged with my analysis. And then they voted, 9-2, to uphold the retreat and establish a permanent quarantine perimeter around Earth's solar system. The majority opinion, written by Admiral Yantara herself, acknowledged that my interpretation may represent a valid alternative reading of the acoustic data, but concluded that the risk profile associated with incorrect threat dismissal exceeds the cost of premature withdrawal. In simpler terms, it might be laughter. But if it isn't, and we go back and they attack, the consequences are worse than the consequences of staying away. The math of fear, the calculation that says uncertainty should always be resolved in favor of the worst case, because being wrong about safety only kills you once. I read the opinion in my quarters and sat with it for a long time, and then I did something that the review board's decision did not prohibit, because nobody had thought to prohibit it. I went back to my console, accessed the fleet's long-range communication receivers, and started listening to Earth. The fleet was positioned at the edge of Earth's solar system, far enough to be outside the quarantine perimeter, close enough to monitor electromagnetic emissions. The fleet's intelligence division was already monitoring human transmissions, cataloging them for threat indicators. But they were listening with the military assessment as their interpretive framework. They were listening for evidence of aggression, mobilization, weapon development, hostile intent. They were listening for the sound of the mask slipping further. I was listening for something else. In the first 2 weeks after the retreat, human transmissions showed exactly what you would expect from a species that had just been abandoned by the first extraterrestrial intelligence it had ever encountered. Confusion, fear, political upheaval, religious crisis, conspiracy theories, military posturing. Every government on the planet was reacting to the fleet's departure with a mix of relief and devastation that was tearing their global response apart. Some factions believed the fleet had been hostile and was driven away by the laughter, which was rapidly becoming mythologized as a moment of human defiance. And other factions believed the fleet had been friendly and was driven away by the laughter, which was being analyzed as a diplomatic catastrophe. The truth that the fleet's departure had nothing to do with what the laughter meant and everything to do with a preloaded contingency protocol triggered by a biased AI was not available to them because they had no way of knowing how we had interpreted the sound. But it was what happened in the third week that changed everything for me. The humans started transmitting again, not to us specifically, into space, in every direction, on every frequency they could reach. They had no way of knowing whether we were still listening, whether we had left the system entirely, or whether we would ever respond, but they transmitted anyway. And what they transmitted was not a military threat, yet not a diplomatic appeal, and not a demand for explanation. They sent laughter. Thousands of recordings, tens of thousands, compiled from every culture on the planet, every language, every context. Babies laughing, children laughing, old people laughing at jokes, at surprises, at absurdity, people laughing through tears, people laughing at funerals, the way humans do when grief becomes so enormous that the only sound left is the one that means I am still alive and the world is still impossible and I refuse to be silent about either. They sent laughter from hospitals and playgrounds and war zones and wedding ceremonies and scientific laboratories and kitchen tables. They sent it with a header message, translated into every language they had received from us during the cultural exchange. Now, that said, this is what that sound means. We were not threatening you. We were happy. Please come back. The fleet's intelligence division intercepted and cataloged the transmissions. Their analysis classified it as coordinated psychological operation designed to establish false emotional rapport for strategic advantage. They recommended increasing the quarantine perimeter. I read their analysis and I felt something I had not felt in my entire career as a xenolinguistic specialist. I felt rage. Clean, bright, clarifying rage. Because I was watching the most powerful military alliance in the galaxy run from the sound of human happiness. And then, when the humans tried to explain their happiness, classify the explanation as a weapon. The framework was eating itself. Every piece of evidence that contradicted the threat assessment was being absorbed by the threat assessment and reinterpreted as further proof of threat. The humans were trapped in a classification loop where nothing they could do would be read as genuine because the system had already decided they were performing. I requested another hearing with the review board. Denied. I filed a formal protest with the Confederated Diplomatic Corps. Acknowledged no action. I submitted a paper to the Xenolinguistic Institute arguing that the fleet's analytical AI had a fundamental structural bias against interpreting human emotional displays as authentic. The paper was published. It was cited in 6 subsequent studies. It changed nothing. The quarantine held. Months passed. The fleet maintained its position at the edge of the solar system, monitoring human transmissions, cataloging them, and interpreting every single one through a framework that could not accommodate the possibility that the species on the other side of the perimeter was exactly what it appeared to be. A civilization reaching out in the only way it knew how, with the only tools it had, hoping that somewhere in the dark, someone was listening. I want to tell you about the last transmission, the one referenced in the official fleet record as Terminal Earth Communication Event. The one that made every Admiral order full retreat, not just from the solar system, but from the entire sector. The one that ended the first contact mission permanently and established the exclusion zone that remains in effect today. It arrived 4 months after the retreat. By then, the human transmissions had evolved. The initial laughter archives had been followed by increasingly sophisticated attempts at communication. Music, scientific data, mathematical proofs, personal messages from individual humans recorded and broadcast into space, talking about their lives, their hopes, their families, their fear that the silence from the fleet meant they had been judged and found unworthy. Those personal messages were the most painful things I have ever listened to. Ordinary people speaking into the dark, not knowing if anyone would hear, saying things like, "I have a daughter, and I want her to grow up in a universe where we are not alone, and please, if you can hear this, we are not what you think we are." The fleet's intelligence division cataloged all of it as psychological operations. Every message, every piece of music, every personal plea, all of it classified as strategic disinformation. I stopped reading their reports. I couldn't. The last transmission came from the same facility that had hosted the original Stage 9 dialogue, the same room, the same communication array. But the panel of 7 was gone. The room was empty except for one person, a woman. Our records identified her as Dr. Amara Osei, a linguist who had been part of the original human contact response team. She was alone. It was late at night by local time. The room was dark except for the glow of the communication console. She sat at the table where the Secretary General had delivered humanity's formal greeting 7 months earlier, and she looked into the camera. And she knew that she was probably talking to no one, and she spoke anyway. She said she understood. That was the first thing she said. She said she understood why we left. She said she had spent 4 months studying the cultural exchange data we had sent during Stage 8, and she had learned enough about Vashon threat assessment frameworks to reconstruct what had probably happened. She said she understood that human laughter was acoustically similar to aggressive dominance displays in several confederated species. She said she understood that a synchronized emotional outburst during formal diplomacy could be misread by systems calibrated for caution. She said she understood that we were afraid, and that fear was rational, given what we didn't know about her species. Then she said something that I have replayed 700 times. And she said, "You sent us your music, your poetry, your mathematical proofs, the things you find beautiful, and we received them, and we understood that you were trying to show us who you are. That is what Stage 8 was. You were being vulnerable. You were asking us to see you, and we did. We saw you. And what I need you to understand is that the laughter was the same thing. You showed us your beauty, and it moved us. And after 47 minutes of trying to be as formal and as careful and as dignified as we could, someone made a joke and we laughed. And the laughter was not about you. The laughter was because of you. Because we were so overwhelmed and so grateful and so terrified of getting this wrong that the only sound we had left was the one that means we are human and we are feeling everything at once. And we cannot hold it all in, and we are sorry. We are so sorry that the most honest sound we make is the one you heard as a threat." She paused. She looked down. And then she laughed, softly, briefly, the kind of laugh that sits right on the edge of crying. She wiped her eyes and said, "There, I just did it again. And I need you to know that what you just heard is not dominance. It is not aggression. It is not a performance. It is the sound of a person who has spent 4 months trying to explain joy to an empty sky and is running out of ways to say it. Laughter is what hope sounds like when it comes out of a human body. That's all it ever was." Yay, she sat there for another moment. Then she reached forward and turned off the transmission. The fleet's AI classified her message as sophisticated individual-level psychological manipulation consistent with advanced strategic deception capability. The threat level was upgraded. Every admiral in the fleet, already primed by months of classification bias and a military assessment that had poisoned the interpretive well before the first word was ever exchanged, ordered full retreat from the sector. The quarantine perimeter was expanded to 100 light-years. The exclusion zone was established, and the first contact mission to Earth was terminated. I filed my final objection the same day. It was rejected in 97 seconds. I resigned my commission the following morning. And I have spent the 8 months since then doing the only thing I can think of to do. I have been compiling every piece of evidence, every acoustic analysis, every cultural study, every personal message that the humans broadcast into the dark. I have been writing this account, and I have been preparing to transmit it, not through confederated channels, which will suppress it, but on an open frequency, aimed at every ship, station, colony, and listening post in the sector. I know what will happen when I do. The Confederated Diplomatic Corps will charge me with unauthorized disclosure of classified intelligence. The fleet's legal compliance AI will issue a warrant. My career, which is already over, will be formally terminated. I may face imprisonment. I'm going to do it anyway. Because somewhere on the other side of a 100-light-year exclusion zone, there is a planet full of people who reached out to the universe with laughter and music and hope and were told by silence that none of it mattered. There is a linguist sitting in a dark room who explained joy to an empty sky and got nothing back. There are 8 billion people who are ready, genuinely and desperately and imperfectly ready, to meet us. And we ran because our systems could not tell the difference between a threat and a feeling. I am not naive. I know the military assessment was not entirely wrong. Humans are violent. Their history is soaked in blood. They fight wars with a frequency and intensity that is genuinely anomalous. But what the assessment missed, what the AI missed, what every admiral in the fleet missed, is that the violence is not the whole picture. It is not even the most important part of the picture. The most important part is the laughter. The fact that a species with that much blood in its history still laughs, still hopes, still sends music into the dark, still whispers jokes during the most important moment of its civilization's existence, because the weight of the moment is so enormous that the only human response is to be, for one ungovernable second, joyfully and ridiculously alive. That is not a threat. That is the most extraordinary thing I have ever encountered, and we left it behind because our protocols had no category for wonder. I am transmitting this account now. I am including the full acoustic analysis of the laughter, Dr. Ossi's final transmission with unedited linguistic annotation, and my complete xenolinguistic assessment of human emotional vocalization. I am sending it everywhere. And I'm including one more thing. Attached to this transmission, you will find a file I've compiled from the Human Cultural Exchange Archive. It is 9 hours long. It contains the laughter they sent us after we left. All of it. Babies and grandfathers and scientists and farmers and children and soldiers and people who were afraid and people who were brave and people who were neither. Just human. Just alive. Just making the sound that means I exist, and the universe is absurd, and I am not going to be quiet about it. Listen to it, please. Before you let the classification stand, before you accept the quarantine, before you agree that the exclusion zone should be permanent, listen to it. And if you hear what I hear, if you hear what Dr. Osei tried to tell us, if you hear what every admiral was too frightened and too primed and too protocol-bound to recognize, then help me do something about it. Because the last transmission from Earth was just laughter, and it was the most important thing anyone has ever said to us, and we hung up.